Welcome to the second IVF Worldwide Online Congress. My name is Milton Leong from Hong Kong.
And my name is Zeev Shoham from Israel.
Today, with great pleasure, we are opening the second IVF Worldwide Online Congress in Reproductive Medicine. The Congress will take place today, Saturday, September 12th, and tomorrow, Sunday, the 13th. Beyond question, this Congress has become the largest ever gathering of professionals in reproductive medicine. Delegates are attending from more than 150 countries, and we are very proud to be bringing the highest quality educational content in reproductive medicine to all corners of the globe. During these times, when the coronavirus pandemic is tragically affecting the entire world, the online Congress has become an important forum for delivering scientific education. Due to its success, we are planning to conduct this Congress twice a year from now on. Registration is free of charge thanks to generous support from our prominent sponsors, Abbott, Vitrolife, IPSA, and Meditex. In addition, we wish to express our appreciation to all our exhibitors.
Based on participation input, the Congress will be conducted over 2 consecutive weekend days. The program is rich in new scientific material and features the best speakers in the field. The program includes 18 different sessions, some of which are conducted in parallel. We are also offering 2 workshops on IVM and ovarian tissue cryopreservation, which can be streamed on demand. Only those who register in advance will be eligible to claim a certificate of attendance and a CME accreditation certificate. The software we developed in-house for medical congresses is straightforward and simple to use. If you have any comments, please write to us as we strive to continuously improve its functionality and performance. Now, without further delay, we are pleased to kick off the first day of the Congress. Thank you for your participation and enjoy the meeting. We have a great pleasure to chair the session, the first one of the second IVF Worldwide Online Congress on Reproductive Medicine. Just because we cannot meet in person does not mean we cannot be together to share ideas and spread knowledge. The first session is about COVID-19 pandemic and reproductive medicine. Our speaker today is Dr. Norbert Gleicher, who is the President, Medical Director, and Chief Scientist of the Center of Human Reproduction in New York, and the President of the not-for-profit Foundation for Reproductive Medicine. Norbert published hundreds of peer-reviewed scientific papers, abstracts, and book chapters in reproductive endocrinology and infertility. The topic of his presentation now is how the identification of specific COVID-19 phenotypes has changed our understanding of anti-COVID immunity. Norbert, please go ahead.
Thank you, Zev. It's a pleasure being here, and it is a pleasure to start on this really amazing and unique conference on this topic. And I want to make it clear from the beginning that I'm obviously a fertility specialist, investigator in reproductive medicine, and not a virologist, and Also not a epidemiologist, even though I've had a longstanding interest in epidemiology. But circumstances in life sometimes lead us to explore new avenues. And the fact that we're all here in this modem today and our experiences over the last 6 months have led me into the subject of COVID-19. Indeed, it has become a very important subject for us. Like always, I have to make a conflict statement, but I obviously have no commercial conflicts regarding any COVID-related issues. As I said, it's a relatively new area for my research interest. And we got involved through the COVID pandemic, which started in New York in March, and so it did in most other parts of the world, led to an economic lockdown, and in the US also led to considerable social unrest. And I'm mentioning all three of these aspects because, as you will see, they formulated our understanding of COVID, and sometimes in very unexpected but interesting ways. Just as a reminder, it seemingly started all in Wuhan, China, already last year in December, and now there's even talk it might have been even a little earlier. First case in the US was reported on the West Coast. In mid-January, first case in New York at the beginning of March. In other words, roughly 6 weeks later. And I will come back to that point as well. Then things started happening very quickly. And the next important date really is around March 18, middle of March. Because this is when the ASRM, for the first time, published guidance that ultimately led to the closure of most IVF centers in the US. At the same time, ESHRE issued an even more extreme guidance, actually stating that women at that time point should avoid pregnancy. We decided not to close our center, and that had to do with the kind of patients we served and our understanding of the guidance. But things then, as you can see here, the number of infection death rates got very quickly much, much worse. And it was a difficult yet interesting time to remain open during that time. And it took until the middle of April until most of our colleagues reopened, while we, during that whole time period, remained open. We decided not to shut down because we felt responsible for our patients, who are different from most other IVF centers in that they are much older and therefore cannot afford to lose the time. But by remaining open when everybody else, or almost everybody else, closed down, we found ourselves in a very interesting situation. And we were basically existing in our specialty without any guidance. Nobody told us what to do, because nobody at that point was really involved in providing fertility services. And we had obvious concerns for our patients. This was the height of infectivity of COVID in New York City. And in fact, New York in those days was considered the hottest point in the world in terms of infection rate. We were concerned for their families, but we were obviously also concerned for ourselves, for our employees, for our staff, and for their families. And we really had to deduct what to do from papers, from knowledge, that we had to literally dig out. It wasn't that we could go to daily ASRM guidelines or ESHRE guidelines. There were none. And that is really the background that led us into a deeper understanding of the COVID crisis. It's what I call the knowledge base. Just as we follow our own reproductive medicine literature, we in detail started to follow the COVID literature, even though up to that point, as I said, we had no special knowledge or special interest in viral diseases in general. The information that was available was indeed often even confusing. Federal and state governments and hospitals were completely unprepared for the pandemic. The government agencies at the time issued confusing guidelines and sometimes even incorrect and counterproductive recommendations. Expert advice changed every 5 minutes. The same expert on television could tell you one day one thing and the next day something completely different. And then there were sometimes obviously incorrect recommendations made that simply made no sense and therefore only re-emphasizing the need to find the best possible information at any given point. We started publishing, and whoever is interested can look that up, it's still online, bulletins where we summarized what we learned because we thought some of our colleagues might benefit from that. What really concerned us the most in those days was the fact that none of the experts and none of the government organizations, for at least the first 2 months, ever talked about unintended consequences from all of those interventions that were recommended and implemented. And that was mind-boggling to us because we felt it was like doing a research project and only pointing out to the IRB in advance what the potential advantages may be without listing the risks. But that's what seemed to have happened during those days. We were told about all the wonderful things that closing down the economy, for example, would cause, but nobody talked about the fact that that would obviously have very, very significant unintended consequences. And so we felt very strongly that we had really to find the truth. And this is where the truth for us started. What you're seeing here on the left are COVID-19 cases in New York City, New Jersey, Connecticut, and in the District of Columbia, in other words, in Washington, D.C. And on the right side, you're seeing the mortality rates from those cases. And the midpoint is the end of April, beginning of May. And when you carefully look at this, you see that those are all East Coast states. And you see that they all demonstrated a very similar pattern of infections. There was a rapid incline in infections and a rapid decline. And the mortality followed by about 10 days, but was following a very similar pattern. Now, again, these infections occurred on the East Coast. Now, I'm going to show you a few other states. And we have here Florida, Texas, Arizona, and California. And you remember that you saw before here on the East Coast those huge bumps in infection and mortality rate. And where you saw those bumps on the East Coast, you suddenly now in the West and in the Southwest, you see nothing. You see that while the East Coast, including us here in New York City, were at the peak experiencing the worst epidemic of any big city in the world, in the same country, almost next door, because Florida is considered almost a neighboring state to New York. There was nothing. There was nothing in Florida, a little bump. But look what happened in Florida starting in June, and in Texas, and in Arizona, and in California. And the same thing with mortalities. They were relatively low, and then towards June, suddenly they started spiking. And this is something that until we wrote about it, some people talked about it, the media addressed it, but nobody really asked the question, how come that certain areas of the US have one pattern and other areas have another pattern, a completely different timing pattern? We call this, the East Coast pattern, the A pattern, and we called this, the so-called Southwestern pattern, the B pattern. Now, we also had a C pattern, which was a combination because a number of states showed kind of a confluence of these two patterns. So there had to be an explanation for the different timing of those two patterns. And then something very interesting happened on a number of levels, but we thought it might give us an explanation. And that was that on May 31 and June 1 was the peak of the social instability here, and the biggest demonstrations took place. What you're seeing here is a picture from our center corner, 69th Street and Madison Avenue, and you see that at 9:30 p.m. some riders were arrested here. And we considered those days as an experiment of nature, because if you remember those days, and they made the media all over, we saw some of the biggest peaceful demonstrations during the daytime, involving tens of thousands of people, and nobody distancing and almost nobody wearing face masks. And this was just at the end of our peak in infections here in New York City. And there was enormous concern expressed from multiple sides that these infections could lead to a rebirth of the disease that we just had suppressed, or where we just had flattened the curve after a few really horrible, horrible weeks. And this concern, caused by all those social tensions, really led to nothing. Surprisingly, nothing. And I'm showing this to you here because this is an updated curve of cases. Now we are at the end of August. Indeed, those curves went to August 25. And here on the left, you see again A states, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and you see that over the last months, meaning after those demonstrations on May 31 and June 1, when you expected another boost to this horribly infectious disease, absolutely nothing happened. To the contrary, in New York, cases have been declining ever since. The same in New Jersey, the same in Connecticut. Yet when you look at B states, California, Florida, Nevada, while we were at the peak of our infection rate, they had nothing. And then, starting in early June, they basically created mirror images of what we had experienced on the East Coast before. Now think about it. What can cause this? Something must cause this. And here you see the same curves regarding mortality. When we had the biggest mortality in the East, those states had barely anything. But when we flattened out, suddenly they had spikes in their mortality. So obviously we were dealing with completely different disease patterns. Everybody noticed them. The newspaper wrote about it. But you know what the interpretations were? While the East was suffering, all the governors in those states were making fun of Eastern states and were saying that they started everything too late, they closed down too late, they didn't know how to manage the epidemic. And then paradoxically, when they started to get sick, our governors used to be saying the same thing about them. So in other words, the explanation was that all of these differences were simply due to politics. And I'm here to tell you that that is not true. Here you see the combined pattern of both epidemics. You see the so-called A, the early wave, and here the second wave in June. And on first impression, it appears that the number of cases in the second wave are higher. And indeed they are, but that may be an artifact because obviously we have enormously increased testing rates. And therefore we find many, many more cases than we did in the early days. But there's no question that the country experienced two waves, with the first wave primarily being on the East Coast and the second wave being in the Southwest. And how can this be explained? How can we explain these epidemic phenotypes? There's only one possible explanation, and that is the term herd immunity. And I'm sure that most of the listeners to this talk have heard about the concept. Mayo Clinic recently defined it as when a large portion of a community, the herd, becomes immune to a viral disease, making the spread of disease from one person to the next unlikely. In other words, if there's enough immunity in a set population, then the virus runs out of new victims, and that means it cannot reproduce and the virus dies off. You remember Zika a few years ago in Brazil. It was a horrible disease. It seemed unstoppable. And then from one day to the other, it was gone. Nobody studied herd immunity in Zika, but it's really the only possible explanation how a virus suddenly can stop. And as I showed you now, all the waves, whether it was the East Coast wave in the A pattern or the B pattern in the southwestern states, all these waves had the same length, roughly 10 weeks. It means that there must be something that stops the virus after those 10 weeks. And we think this is herd immunity, and we started thinking about that when we first noticed the patterns that I have shown you. But then papers were published from all over the world, Spain, Sweden, and here in New York City, that showed that even in those locations where the virus was quite prominent in the early phase, the antibody positivity in the population was surprisingly low. In other words, antibodies to the COVID virus existed in Spain, which was horribly affected by the early wave, in only 5% of patients. In Sweden, 7%. In New York, where the highest peaks were measured, only 10 to 20%. And that means that herd immunity was very, very far away, because herd immunity at that point was understood as 60 to 80% of the population must show antibodies. And the conclusion of experts after seeing those numbers was that we better get a vaccine quickly because we can never reach herd immunity. They were wrong, because something very interesting happened. Researching this COVID virus researchers in a number of laboratories around the world, roughly within a 2-month period, all discovered that there is a kind of long-term immunity that is not antibody dependent. Up to that point, the common wisdom, the dogma in epidemiology and in infectious diseases was that long-term immunity is specific and has to be antibody dependent. And in other words, you have a viral infection, you get an IgM response, and after 30 days, an IgG response, and it is the IgG response that gives you long-term immunity against the virus, with long-term being defined differently in different viruses. In some viruses, it can be lifelong. In other viruses, like the flu, it's at most a year because of the mutation of the flu virus. So what was discovered suddenly in 4 or 5 publications from different labs was that besides the antibody immunity, which is created by what we call the adaptive immune system, and which is created obviously with a delay, because you have the switch from IgM to IgG antibody production. We obviously also have a second part of our immune system, which is called the innate immune system, and which in ontogeny and timing actually precedes the adaptive immune system. In other words, it's a more primitive immune system. And this is based on cellular activity, meaning that if an infection happens, cellular cells accumulate at the site of the infection, release cytokines, and so in a first defense, protect the host. And this innate immune process was believed to be only an immediate immune process, was not believed to be a long-term, a memory immune process. And what these 4 or 5 papers now demonstrated is that actually the innate immune system also offers a long-term immunity. And more than that, the immunity is not as specific as with the antibody immunity, but it is cross-reactive. And what they found is that related viruses that we all may have been exposed to in preceding months and years, such as cold viruses or flu viruses, which come from the same family as COVID-19 comes, that the immunity that we created, the cellular memory immunity that we created from those infections, and maybe from the flu vaccines at this time that we also got, that by itself also is active against COVID-19. And that is a remarkable discovery, because think about it, we never knew that this kind of long-term immunity exists, and it has since already shown that it exists in viruses like HIV, for example, as well. So it is not a unique thing to this family of viruses, but it is a completely new recognition in immunology of enormous importance. And it says that we don't even necessarily have to be contaminated with COVID-19, but that we can have immunity that we acquired from similar viruses that helps us against getting infected by COVID-19 or helps us in getting milder disease. So robust T-cell immunity, COVID-19, has now been reported not only in convalescent patients who had the disease and in asymptomatic carriers and mild cases, but even in uninfected individuals. That is remarkable, because all of this means that many more people have already immunity to COVID-19 than only those 5 to 20% of people who were found to have antibody immunity against the virus. In other words, the immunity in areas that had COVID-19 infections is much higher than we assumed based only on antibody testing. So I mentioned that this immunity is cross-reactive with other SARS viruses, such as simple cold and influenza, other viruses, and herd immunity, therefore, is much higher than we assumed. Let me close with a few additional slides. A recent study in Science looked at the SARS virus in Northern California and found that it is really not, and that is not surprising, it is really not only one virus, but like most viruses, it constantly mutates a little bit. And they found just in that small area where they ran this investigation, they found 7 different lineages of the virus within a relatively small geographic area. Yet, those lineages were functionally not different. They were all the same. And they were evenly distributed. It was not that one was selected out. And here you have to understand something very important that is not widely reported in the literature and also not in the media. There is now a well-recognized reason why our observation that the virus behavior on the East Coast and in the Southwest was so different. We can explain it now. Because as it turns out, the US was infected with the virus in 2 different ways. The West Coast got a virus directly from China. And that virus was called D614. The East Coast, and I told you that the first case on the East Coast was reported only 6 weeks later. The East Coast was infected, however, from a virus that came from Europe. And in Europe, something very interesting happened. The virus, the D614, mutated. It mutated only in one location on the spike protein of the virus, one single protein mutation. And it went from so-called D614 to G614. And that one difference made this new virus that hit us on the East Coast 10 times more infectious than the original Chinese virus. And this is, in our opinion, the principal reason for the differences I started out telling you earlier. One simple amino acid change in the spike protein of the virus, which is where most antigenicity is and where all the vaccines that are in the works are trying to attack, one simple amino acid change made this humongous difference. Moreover, as a study by Corbra et al. Just last week in Cell, or 2 weeks ago in Cell, also demonstrates, this new mutation is evolutionary greatly advantaged. It is now the virus that has taken over from the milder D614 region. Now, what does this further mean, at least in our opinion? It means that when the virus first hit the US, and from the west with the D614, from the east with the G614, the country got infected by 2 different viruses. One was milder and therefore caused fewer infections and fewer deaths. The other one was much more infectious and probably more aggressive and probably therefore more immunogenic. There is no other explanation possible for the fact that we here, as we sit here today, and I'm speaking to you from New York, we have basically no COVID disease for a few weeks. While just down south from here in Florida, the virus is going crazy. And the reason for that is that down there in Florida, where they had almost no disease while New York was burning, symbolically speaking, they in those days were infected by the D614 strain. They are now going through a second wave with the G614 strain. And just as New York became immune to the virus and now has no disease because we likely have reached herd immunity, so will within the next 4 weeks, Florida and Texas and California, which had huge spikes starting in June, but are already on declining arm of the wave, they will also reach herd immunity. That is at least our hypothesis for what has been happening and is our explanation for why there have been two such radically different patterns in timing and in severity of disease between different states in the US. And I don't want you to believe that what I've just told you applies only to different states in the US. We also looked at patterns in certain European countries and, for example, in Israel. And I think those countries that now see a second wave are actually just being exposed to the G strain, while before they have been exposed by the D strain. And therefore, they are just now in the process of developing herd immunity. But the good news in all of this, if we are right in our interpretation, is that is within the next 4 weeks, I think we all will reach herd immunity, and that the fall wave that everybody is so fearful of will hopefully not happen, because we will all be immune. We all will have reached herd immunity to the G614 strain, as long, of course, as no new mutation comes either into our country or appears anywhere in the world. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer any further questions.
Norbert, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. I have a few questions for you. We'll be a little bit short of time, so if we can shorten the answer. The last time we had an interview with you, it was during the time that you have in New York riots and the pandemic was actually, as you mentioned, burning the city. Can you let us know what is the situation now when you said that the virus is almost disappeared from New York? Is it all open? Are you returned to normal life? Are you going out with masks? What's precautions you have?
We are far from being back in normal life, but that brings us back to the issue that a lot of what is happening here in the US, at least, is more political than medical in the decision-making process. We are 2 months before elections, and this is a major item, political item. Life has normalized. The restaurants have opened, but only outdoors. Masks are still strongly recommended, and people are adhering to mask wearing more than they did in the past. Schools are opening partially, but we are certainly not back to normal. But when you look at the infection rates, positive tests, I'm not even talking about hospital admissions and mortality, which are basically back to normal, but infection positive testing is below 1%. So that means basically there's really practically no new disease here. And we don't see, at least in A states, we don't see any mortality.
Based on what you describe in your lecture, do you think it will influence the production of the vaccine? Will it make it easier, difficult? Do we have repeated, vaccination?
Yeah, that is a very, very good question. Frankly speaking, my own bias is that we probably won't need a vaccine anymore, at least where that kind of herd immunity has developed. Now, we do not know yet how long this immunity lasts. So it is entirely possible that this will have to be something, or that this is something like with the flu, that every year there come new mutations, and you need a vaccine every year made up of new antigens. But I think that for this fall, if we are correct in our interpretation of findings, we think we will not see another COVID wave. And if you look at what has been happening in the Southern Hemisphere, they have experienced actually the lowest flu prevalence in decades. They are usually a few months ahead of us with the flu epidemic of the fall season. And they had basically no flu this year because of all the distancing and the mitigation efforts against COVID was also effective against the flu, of course.
I read the paper this morning that estimate that we will be with the COVID at least by the end of 2021. Are you more optimistic?
Yeah, I'm much, much more optimistic. I think that that we will be below 1% antibody testing in most of the developed world by October.
Good. Okay, so we'll plan our next visit to New York.
I am very much looking forward, and I'm also looking forward to visit you in Israel.
So thank you very much for an excellent talk. And we have to go forward and to move on. Thank you again.
Pleasure.
It's now a pleasure to present Professor Milton Leong. Professor Milton Leong is the co-chairman of this Congress, and he is my co-founder of IVF Worldwide, which we established 12 years ago. Since then, he is very active in the field of education, and during the years, he published more than 150 scientific papers. Milton was the first to establish the first IVF clinic in Hong Kong, and he delivered the first IVF baby in Hong Kong. He is also working at the Women's Clinic in Hong Kong, and it's a pleasure that we have him today to give a presentation on IVF in the time of COVID-19 pandemic, securing safe practice. So Milton, the stage is yours, and thank you again for being with us.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Seth, for the very kind introduction. And I'm very happy to be here to join this online Congress. And I will be happy to share my experience with the COVID-19 pandemic, how we practice and how we try our best to secure a safe practice for us and for the patients. So, as we know, we have, as of last week in August, already over 21 million people affected in the world. And out of that, almost 800,000 deaths. So this epidemic has literally locked down the whole world in the last 4 or 5 months, and it's only in the last month or two that countries are trying their hardest to, for the sake of economy, to try and open up the different kinds of restrictions that are practiced in the countries. So firstly, I would like to share my experience, our experience in Hong Kong. And, we, in this pandemic, because we have our experience with the SARS coronavirus, in 2003. So we took the pandemic and we took this virus very seriously. All Chinese and old Hong Kong expats, immediately we went into the mask mode. Because of this, and because IVF can be considered an emergency medical service, we did not suspend our service. The Hong Kong government has set up screening criteria corresponding to and notification requirements. We have also have precautionary measures in order to safeguard against the COVID virus. So far, because Hong Kong had applied strict hygiene practices, wearing masks, social distance, screening and quarantine, clinics in Hong Kong who have patients for emergence of necessary diseases work as usual. In fact, apart from the initial 2 weeks, there has been no report of any clinic where the staff or patient had COVID-19 disease. In the first 2 weeks, there has only been 4 patients diagnosed in clinics, plus 1 clinic staff. And this includes all doctors' clinics, and there's no suspect or active diseases in any IVF clinics. And in Hong Kong, we did very well for a while until in June, when we tried to open up, like most countries in the world, to open up bars and to open up to lessen the social distance requirements, and also because we allowed some groups of so-called essential trade exemptions, like for instance pilots and air crews, and also drivers and delivery goods from trains, buses, lorries, and also from sea transportation into Hong Kong for goods and food and etc. There were over 200,000 of these exempted visitors, and that led to, in July, a second wave. So our number of cases went up from 1,000 to more than 5,000. So right away, we go back to strict restriction. So now in Hong Kong, no food service from 6 p.m. onwards. Bars and gymnasiums and all public services are closed. And also, apart from, of course, from wearing masks and things like that, no services, food services can have more than 2 persons. Anyway, it seems to be getting better again. And in our clinics, we apply the following measures and rules to protect the staff and client while maintaining our services. So for the staff, the following staff should avoid working. If a staff who returned to Hong Kong from overseas, who had close contact with family members who had such traveling, they are not allowed to work for a period of 14 days after their arrival. If anyone who has close contact with a suspected or confirmed cases of COVID-19 infection, they're not allowed to work. And anyone who have any illness, fever, or respiratory symptoms, they are not allowed to work. At the clinic, we have temperature check at the entrance. Everyone has to maintain good personal and hand hygiene practice all times, keeping both hands clean by washing before and after work and after each case. Wearing a mask before entering the clinic. The mask should cover the nose, mouth, and chin, and anyone who are in the clinic has to wear a mask at all times, except drinking or eating. And of course, they wear PPE when involved in any procedures. For our patients, we inform patients who want to book for consultation or treatment that we would not book any patients who had visited any overseas countries, areas, mainland China, or for a period of 14 days after their arrival. We don't book who have been in contact with anyone with a confirmed case of COVID-19 in the last 14 days. And we don't book anyone who had close contact with anyone who had visited overseas mainland China, including their family members living in the same household for a period of 14 days after their arrival, and whoever had any illness, fever, or respiratory symptoms. Also, access control and temperature check for everyone, and everyone who had body temperature of 37.5 degrees above will not be permitted to enter. Maintain good hand hygiene. Before they come in, they have hands clean, with alcohol or other cleaning solutions. They have to wear masks before entering the clinic and at all times while in the clinic. We also limit visitors for any patients, no more than 2 persons to accompany per patient at any time. And also they have to fulfill a questionnaire, and so before the entrance, before they can go through the temperature check. And here is an example of our initial questionnaire. So they have to put down the name, they have to put down their passport number, Hong Kong ID number, their contact number, and they have asked generally just 7 questions: whether they have been traveled to mainland China or any overseas countries in the last 14 days. Do they live with family members who have traveled to mainland China or any overseas countries in the last 14 days? Whether they have traveled to China or any overseas and developed any cough, shortness of breath, loss of taste or smell within 14 days of the traveling. Whether they have close contact with any suspected or confirmed cases in the last 14 days, and whether they themselves had ever been diagnosed as a confirmed case, and if they have lived in the same building with a confirmed COVID-19 case in the last 14 days, or they work on the same floor with a COVID-19 case in the last 14 days. So they have to answer yes or no, and before they can go on to the second part, which is the temperature check. This is a notice we put out in our clinic so that everyone would know how from 1, 2, 3, 4, the 8 points, whatever they have been in contact, or whether they've been away, or whether they have visited, family or friends, in a confirmed in place, any place with a confirmed case, or even, whether they have visited someone in a hospital, they have to report. So these measures were set up since the first day of the China cases in January. And modifications were made as more information and supports are available. PCR and NGS tests now available, and patients are welcome to voluntarily test themselves prior to treatment. But because as yet, like everywhere else in the world, the test is not common enough to be mandatory or being followed each time they come to clinic. In the end, well, it's just like, for instance, if someone The ideal case would be someone tested negative before they start the treatment, and they should probably keep on testing negative every time they come to clinic for monitoring. But this is not practicable, and it will become a big burden on the patients and also on the clinic staff to monitor this. So at the moment, NGS tests or PCR tests for patients are now voluntary, and we don't mandatorily make them do it because the logistic is so complex. So this is at entrance. They come in through one side and they go out through the other side. And here is a demonstration of our temperature control. As you can see, this particular person who is wearing a mask already, has a normal temperature. Also, in our reception area, we set up plexiglass barriers so that there's no direct contact, from the or an added protection from our staff against any patients when they come in and when they check in or when they ask any questions. In the checkout area where they pay, you can see we also have a plexiglass barrier so that there's no direct contact and no sort of aerosol transmissions. And you can also see the alcohol hand cleaning. So we encourage everyone before and after they pay or they receive medicine to wash their hands and keep it safe. This is just one last stuff like this is one of our anesthesiologists who works in our egg collection operating room, and this is just a very, very local, cheap and effective way for her to be separated from the patients while she's administering anesthetic. So, in one of the conclusions I can make is we did not shut down services, but actively protect our staff and clinic and clients, as well as preventing infections. We also believe that the patients in Hong Kong are responsible persons, and that they worry more about COVID-19 than us, and therefore, they would not come for treatment if they themselves had any suspicions that they may be affected. We keep open because it's essential medical service, but like most places, our attendance rate dropped about 50% in the last 6 months. We counsel all our patients when they call up, for appointments or anything along the line, and we counsel all our patients regarding the virus, the pandemic, and we offer tests if they choose. In that case, they have to do the test, and only negative tested will be treated. All patients chose to have embryos frozen for future frozen embryo transfer, and no patient have chosen to have fresh embryo transfer. So this concludes the first part of my presentation. The second part, I would like to share a little bit of my view, and also remind the audience what happened with COVID-19. COVID-19 timeline, the first case in Wuhan in China was in December 2019. And in January 2020, it's a confirmed epidemic of atypical pneumonia in China, which is SARS-like. By 12th of January, within the 2 weeks, the coronavirus was confirmed and a genetic sequence was done, and then this was shared to the world on COVID-19. On the 13th of January, the first exported case was diagnosed in Thailand from someone who's returned from Wuhan. And on the 30th of January, there's already 7,818 cases in China and 82 cases in 18 centuries worldwide. So in the beginning of, in the first 2 weeks of February, WHO has convened research forum, and then there's a WHO China joint mission with experts from Canada, Germany, Japan, Nigeria, Korea, Russia, Singapore, and also from the USA represented by CDC and NIH. In this week-long forum, there's the report, which is about 35 pages long. It formulated plans including research control and also education aspect, among others. And the main education things come out is that people should wear masks, people should wear hands frequently, and social distance. By 11th of March, WHO declared COVID-19 as a pandemic. Genetic-wise, COVID-19 is a beta coronavirus, and as it rages across the world, its genetic, its genes and the genetic has been sequenced, and it's found to be mainly two groups. A is from East Asia, and group B is from Europe. There's about 10 subgroups in A and 6 subgroups in B. And like any good virus, is continuously mutating, but it is believed that the virus itself is constant enough that vaccines can be made and can be effective. The A virus, Eastern Asia, is the one started in China, may be responsible for the initial cases. However, sometime in February, there appeared to be a hiatus period, and then the B type became the dominant strain, responsible for cases in the rest of the world, except Asia, Australia, And the European strain seems to be more infectious and more virulent. The A type seems to be contained, and new cases are low in Asia. So this is the source. There's from Cato Institute. This is epidemiology study, not a gene study and a clinical study. And there seems to be, seems to be a pause, of about 2 weeks, where the first case is mainly A, and then the rest, as it rages around the world, the subtype seems to begin to be B, and this is shown up as in this scattergram. So you can see, the A type A is mainly initially and is in Asia and Asia mainly, and Europe, North America is mainly the B type, which has become the dominant type going on. And if we can see, this is something from the death rate, so you can see, that certain countries has very high death rates, and but although low infection rate, and the highest infection rate, is still in North America and South America, United States of America, and also in Brazil. And this curve shows that as time goes on, USA and Brazil is still rising, but most of the world now is flattening. UK, Italy, France is only rising slowly, coming to what's recognized as the second wave, as economy and also social distance lessen. And this is this is from the CDC, and you can see that in America the infected cases keep on rising, but the death rate has peaked around May, and then since then has been coming down. Another just curve to show, that in USA there's a double a peak around April, and then a slowdown or flattening. But after June, when social distance is relaxed or people are encouraged, to open up to save the economy, the cases are rising rapidly. And this is showing about the same thing. That the countries that has the least wearing mask percentage is also the countries that has the highest number of confirmed cases. However, if we look at the death rate, of countries, we can see, there is actually a reduction in the death rate for all the cases around the world. So this may be good news. And this slide shows, what a second wave would look like. This is Hong Kong, where you have from March and April a peak, and then everything calmed down until in July, when we have a second wave that that is sort of like very, very prominent. So if we look at America on the sum of new cases and the sum of new deaths, it shows again there is actually not really a second wave, but the first wave has never really stopped, as Dr. Fauci may have said. But even if you look at second wave, it is only after the restriction and after people's is less concerned about the disease, and they're going out socializing more. So finally, I would like to share with you the lessons I think I've learned and my rambling thoughts. Firstly, it's almost impossible to do what China did, that a total lockdown of a city. But at the end, it was the only way to stop transmission. Once transmitted abroad, it rapidly becomes a community disease. And once become a community disease, it's difficult to get to the source, and therefore it's very difficult to control. In the beginning, the world has a complacency to treat it as a Chinese problem, leading to our present state, there is a pandemic. And of course, not wearing masks or the anti-mask policy initially have great negative impact. No social distancing without masks compounded the problem. Second wave around the world is evident and prove that stringent control of human behavior is the only way to control the spread. Here's the news, the good news. I think more and more people are conforming to take care of themselves. They wear masks, and people are social distancing and staying home. And this has become a normal behavior around the world. Although cases are still out of control, the death rate is declining. So this may be due to better diagnosis, earlier diagnosis because of testing and treatment, but it also may be that we are adapting just as the virus is adapting to us. So the virus is infectious, but its virulence is reducing, so that the virus and us will be so to survive each other and coexist. So at the end, like influenza, and it may even be easier to treat influenza because we now know that the mutation is Yes, there are mutations, but it doesn't. But the virus itself seems to be the same. So vaccine may be more effective. And another good news is that vaccines are coming, and we can look at some help definitely. Finally, I would strongly advise people who may listen to stay safe, stay away from crowds, don't go anywhere that you may be exposed. Practice social distance. You can help the economy by social distancing too. By all means, take care of personal hygiene, washing hands frequently, and most important, the only thing that will help us to control the pandemic is to wear masks. And as the study shows, even a two-plied polyethylene mask will block 90%, will reduce 90% of the virus transmission. So let's work together to try and get this pandemic under control, and but at the same time stay safe. And I hope you wear masks and have a good practice again. Thank you for listening.
Milton, thank you very much for an excellent presentation, a very, very good overview. And I have a few questions which are really curious to know what you think about.
Yes.
And the first one, do you do COVID tests to the staff, and how often?
Well, here's there's we don't ask our staff all to have COVID tests. There's a little bit of selfishness that we're because in Hong Kong, anyone who doing a test has to be reported, and then the test actually is all monitored, by the Department of Health. So, if a staff is tested positive, if we do universal screening, then the clinic would be branded as infected site. We work with the staff, and the staff does not want to have this happen anyway. So so they report any contact. So for instance, even if their building, their apartment building, with 100, 200 units, if the apartment building have one case, they would go to be tested. They would be off work. They'll be tested, and twice. They'll be tested twice before they can come back to work. So there's no compulsory mandatory test for everybody, staff as well as patients. But we encourage people to report to us, and because our case number, the infected case number is still small, in Hong Kong compared to other countries, that we still can manage.
Okay. And how do you keep the staff or manage the staff on the way to the clinic, on the way home, and being at home? Because they meet the children, small children, family, they're coming in bus with the underground. So, they are very careful at the clinic. So, but what's the instruction? How do you instruct them to manage when they are leaving the clinic and being at home?
Yes, Seth, this is an excellent question. We cannot, of course, control the staff, and say that you have to take certain routes or do certain things, but we discuss, this obviously. Firstly, in Hong Kong, wearing a mask is probably like about 95%, 97%. Only Caucasians would not wear masks. Everyone else, most Caucasians wear masks, but if you see a person without a mask, it's most likely Caucasian, or someone who's from, say, maybe Middle East, who's not wearing a mask. Now, so basically all the public transportation, everything, is quite safe in this. But on top of that, we encourage them to make sure, that they have, whenever, they get out of the public transportation, for instance, to get to their home, that they would completely wash, change their clothes, before they would do anything. So, we talk about personal hygiene, and we try to just by encouraging personal hygiene, we try to control the disease. And history, both in the SARS times, and also now, it is quite successful.
Just one short question and short answer. Do you have any special setup of the air condition?
We don't. In our center, we have we talk about we talk about the general, the clinic side. In the clinic side, we have our own HU on each floor. So, on our floor of the clinic, we have our own HU, and we also added air purifiers. And there's a lot of humidifier type aerosols, that has in Hong Kong. There's a very popular one that's got a very diluted chlorine, and we do have this in a clinic, so keep the air a little bit sort of like disinfected. Now, in our IVF site, the IVF operating rooms and the IVF lab has each their own individual air, and each have their own HU. So there's 3 HU for the 2 operating rooms and for the IVF lab, and one of them join up, to be backup for each other. Now, and each time, the air is enclosed, and each time we only allow 10% of outside air gotten up from the 38th floor of a tall building. So it seems to be okay, and we can change air 24 times an hour. As well as, we have a series of disinfectants consisting of ultraviolet and ultraviolets, and also different screens of different sizes, and happy filters, and and they're totally separate. So I think, IVF lab and IVF operating room, the air is as clean as can be. Of course, no one can check and see whether there's any viral particles. I don't know how to check it, but we believe, it's probably safe enough.
Milton, thank you very much. It was really exciting. Thank you for this information. And we have to stop here and continue with the program. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, one last word is, yes, this pandemic is going to be with us, for maybe a couple of years, even with vaccine. So, so I hope everyone, will take care, personal hygiene, wear masks, most important.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I would like now to present our next speaker, Professor Ze'ev Blumenfeld. Ze'ev is Associate Professor at the Technion Faculty of Medicine. He is also the Chief Gynecologist for the Israeli Northern District Medical Services. He published more than 230 peer-reviewed papers, and his main interest is fertility preservation and reproductive endocrinology in infertility. The topic of his presentation for today's Congress is the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on IVF. Ze'ev, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Ze'ev, for the kind introduction and for the invitation. The 1919 H1N1 pandemic infected 500 million and killed more than 50 million, about 10%. The current COVID-19 pandemic has infected 17 million and killed almost 700,000, which is about 4 to 5%. However, we are not over yet. Young age did not confer absolute protection. A significant number of critically ill patients, including deaths, have been in their 30s and 40s, and some even younger than that. In a contrast to influenza virus infection, 118 pregnant infected women in Wuhan, China, did not exhibit an increased risk of complications or severe disease. Initial testing of newborns for this virus was negative, as were breast milk samples. Is COVID-19 really innocent? Is there a vertical transmission? What are the possible effects on the parturient, on the fetus and neonate? What are the implications on IVF and on our male and female patients? Regarding the parturient, in a Wuhan report, none of the newborns of 6 positive parturients displayed the virus. However, their umbilical blood did display virus-specific antibodies, 5 cases of increased IgG and 2 increased IgM. Unlike IgG, the larger IgM does not usually pass the placenta. Abnormal placental weights and pathology were observed in 2 patients infected with this virus in the 3rd trimester. It has been speculated that the IgM detected in the neonates could have evolved from the abnormal or damaged placenta, or possibly generated by the neonates in response to transplacental infection. Indeed, placental vascular abnormalities were detected in SARS-CoV-2 infection. Of 91,000 women with confirmed SARS-CoV-2, 9% were pregnant. Cough occurred in 52% and dyspnea in 30%. However, pregnant women were less likely than the non-pregnant controls to have fever, muscle ache, chills, and diarrhea. Diabetes, chronic lung disease, and cardiovascular disease were more frequent in pregnant women. And pregnancy was associated with hospitalization with a relative risk of 5, intensive care unit admission, intubation, but no deaths. Preterm birth has been reported in COVID-19. In a 2nd trimester miscarriage, SARS-CoV-2 nucleic acid sequences were not detected in fetal tissues following maternal infection. However, the placenta and cotyledon biopsies tested positive, whereas the umbilical cord, amniotic fluid, and the fetal mouth, armpit, anus, liver, thymus, and lung, all of these tested negative. In a New England Journal of Medicine publication in May, 215 obstetrical patients have shown 88% of the positive parturients for SARS-CoV-2 being asymptomatic. 13.5%, which is more than 1 in 8 asymptomatic parturients, were positive for the virus, and less than 2% symptomatic. However, the true prevalence of the infection may be underreported due to false negative. A BMJ study in UK has shown that 427 hospitalized parturients at 34 weeks with SARS-CoV-2, there was excess risk among minorities during pregnancy. For Black women, more than 8 times, and for Asian, more than 4 times. Age above 35 and obesity carry higher risk for hospitalization, and the deliveries were 75 at term and 25% premature, 7% because of COVID-19 complications. 59% had cesarean deliveries, most of them for non-COVID related reasons. 10% of the parturients required respiratory support and 1.2% died, 3 of COVID-19 complications. 12 neonates tested positive for SARS-CoV-2, 6 of them within 12 hours. 2 neonates died, 3 were stillborn, but the relation to SARS-CoV-2 was not quite clear. Although originally thought that pregnant women with COVID-19 were no more likely to develop severe morbidity, recent reports suggest that a subset may develop multi-organ failure, and some of them even die. Whereas pregnancy is a pro-thrombotic and inflammatory state exaggerated by infection, such patients may be at an increased risk for thromboembolic phenomena. The frequency of such disorders was 25% in one publication, and in another series with COVID-19 pneumonia, more than 30% of thromboembolic phenomena such as PE, ischemic stroke, DVT, or myocardial infarction. The COVID-19 infection leads to multi-organ dysfunction due to the cytokine storm, leading to production of tissue factors and activating thrombin. Elevated D-dimer more than 1 microgram per ml is considered as an evidence for increased thrombin generation and is associated with increased mortality with a hazard risk of more than 18. Low molecular weight heparin treatment has improved prognosis in severe infection, leading the International Society of Thrombosis and Hemostasis to recommend that low molecular weight heparin is considered in all pregnant women with COVID-19. The coagulation abnormalities in hospitalized COVID-19 patients showed increased D-dimers, fibrinogen, fibrin, fibrinogen degradation product, and cytokines, and a decrease in antithrombin and platelets, showing microthrombi in the pulmonary arterial vasculature. Is indeed COVID-19 aggravating the risk of venous thromboembolism associated with hypoestrogenic milieu, such as in controlled ovarian hyperstimulation for in vivo or for IVF patients, in pregnancy, in users of birth control pills, or users of menopausal hormone? Should we therefore consider low molecular heparin in IVF due to the high estrogens? A recent systematic review has shown that the rate of severe pneumonia in pregnant women was up to 14%. Most pregnancies delivered by cesarean section, 1 case of neonatal asphyxia and death. 2% of the neonates were positive for the virus. There were 9 maternal deaths, 4 cases of IUFD, 3 neonatal deaths, and 2 neonatal infections. Clinical implications: there are still insufficient good quality data to draw unbiased conclusions regarding complications in pregnant women as well as the vertical transmission. 241 women with third trimester viral infection delivered in New York. 2.5% of the newborns were positive for the virus. The sole factor associated with COVID-19 severity was maternal obesity with a BMI more than 30. However, age, race, ethnicity, and other underlying medical conditions had no influence different from other publications. Women with severe or critical COVID-19 infection had excess risk for preterm delivery or almost 60% cesarean section. There were 2 cases of intrauterine fetal demise, both in women with severe COVID-19 infection. And another written meta-analysis has shown a high rate of maternal neonatal complication in infected patients. The maternal complication was 45%, an astonishing high rate of cesarean section, 88%. Intensive care unit admission up to 20%, preterm deliveries 23%, pneumonia and RDS were the most frequent neonatal complication, and there were 6% of neonatal infections. What is the effect on the fetus and the neonate? 9% of the neonates were found positive by a recent JAMA Pediatrics publication. The most seriously ill neonate of these 3 may have been symptomatic from prematurity, asphyxia, and sepsis rather than SARS-CoV-2 infection. Probably the SARS-CoV-2 sources in the neonates were of maternal origin. Although 2 studies have shown negative SARS-CoV-2 amniotic fluid, cord blood, and breast milk, the vertical maternal fetal transmission cannot be ruled out. And here we can see that it lasted between 5 and 9 days from the delivery for these affected neonates to show positive RT-PCR for the virus. A Nature Communication publication found transplacental transmission of the virus in a neonate born to an infected mother. The transmission was confirmed by virologic and pathologic investigations, showing maternal viremia and placental infection and inflammation documented by very high viral load by histology and immunohistochemistry. Neonatal viremia following placental infection was documented. The neonate presented with neurological manifestations similar to those described in adult patients, and the fetal heart rate tracing of this neonate was pathologic with fetal tachycardia, low variability, no accelerations, and recurrent pleuron and late decelerations. Furthermore, MRI at the age of 11 days has shown hyperintensity of the white matter, as shown by these arrows. A very recent this month's publication shows the strong possibility of vertical transmission of COVID-19 from a mildly symptomatic RT-PCR negative and negative RT-PCR mother, but antibody positive mother with significant symptomatic early onset neonatal infection. What are the implications on IVF? The good news comes from New York, from the group of Zev Rosenbachs. A delay in IVF treatment up to 6 months did not affect the live birth rate for women with poor ovarian reserve, with a low MH below 1.1 nanogram per mil, when compared to immediate or IVF within 90 days. This is also pertinent for the highest risk patients, those with poor ovarian response, AMH below 0.45, or those older than 40 years and low AMH. reassuring results. Here we can see that the live birth rate was 11% among those who had immediate IVF or within 3 months, as compared to similarly 12.8% delivery rate as for those who have undergone their IVF with a delay up to 6 months. The SARS-2 virus invades the cell by binding to angiotensin-converting enzyme 2 and modulating its expression. ACE2, a pivotal component of the renin-angiotensin system, modulates angiotensin 2 and 1 to 7. ACE2 is widely expressed in the ovary, oocyte, uterus, vagina, and the placenta. And the ACE2 and angiotensins regulate folliculogenesis, ovulation, can modulate angiogenesis of the corpus luteum, luteolysis, and influence endometrial changes and embryogenesis. Thus, this virus may disturb the female reproductive functions through regulating S2. 219 nCoV may infect the ovary, uterus, vagina, and placenta through the ubiquitous expression of ACE2 in these tissues. The receptors or binding sites necessary for viral penetration are four located in the plasma membrane, such as ACE2, TMPR, SS4, furin, and BSG. Two of those binding sites are extracellular, and one of them is intracellularly located. Stanley and colleagues in a recent fertility and sterility publication did not detect the co-expression of ACE2 and TMP-RSS2 in sperm or testicular cells. However, they did detect the expression of these two binding sites in a subpopulation of oocytes in primate ovarian tissue. BSG may modulate viral entry, and CTSL potentially cleaves the viral S protein. BSG was more broadly expressed across testicular cells than ACE2 and was co-expressed with CSTL in primary spermatocytes. Similarly, other two binding sites for the virus, BSG and CTSL, were detectable in all the 18 tested cumulus cells. Nevertheless, these investigators concluded that SARS-CoV-2 is unlikely to have long-term effects on male and female reproductive function, suggesting that the risk of IVF are not altered by COVID-19 pandemic. Although they may be right and possibly reassuring, we still need to be on the alert and live with uncertainty, because this virus has been detected in various secretions: saliva, stool, urine, and GI tract secretions. Furthermore, 27 viruses have been detected in human semen in association with viremia, speculating that the presence of viruses in semen may be more common than appreciated. Indeed, Lee and colleagues identified SARS-CoV-2 in the semen of almost 16% of the positive patients, 27% in the acute stage. The semen of almost 9% of recovering patients tested positive for this virus, with no difference in days since the clinical recovery, suggesting that the semen may be contagious for the virus not only in the acute stage, but even later on. However, it is not known yet for how long the semen may be infectious. Assuming that most patients will abstain from intercourse in the acute phase due to weakness, erectile dysfunction, or possibly fear of transferring the infection to their partners, this may not be true for recovering patients, leading to several urgent and important questions. For how long should the recovering patients abstain from intercourse? Are condoms protected? Are the laboratory personnel in contact with patient semen at risk of acquiring infection? If the semen may be infectious, would the generated embryo and the female partners be at risk of acquiring the disease? What are the possible remote consequences on the future infants? Indeed, many important alarming questions, but only few reliable answers. Finally, what is the effect of this virus infection on the male and female patients? 18 semen samples from recovered men obtained 8 to 54 days after no symptoms, 14 from controls, and 2 from COVID-19 infected patients were tested for the virus. No viral RNA was detected in the semen, including the 2 patients with an acute infection. Patients with a moderate infection showed an impairment of sperm quality. To conclude that mild COVID-19 infection is not likely to affect testis and epididymal function, although semen parameters were impaired after a moderate infection. Viral RNA was undetected in semen of recovered and acute positive men, suggesting there is no viral transmission during sexual contact and ART. ACE2 and TMPRSS2 expression, which are necessary for viral cellular entry, is relatively limited in the testis. There are conflicting reports about the presence of the virus in the semen of patients diagnosed with the COVID-19 infection. SARS-CoV-2 was not detected in the semen in 2 previous series. However, Lee and colleagues detected the virus in semen sample of almost 16% of patients either recovering or with acute infection. The entry of the virus to the male reproductive tract may affect spermatogenesis and reproduction. The male reproductive tract has been shown to be involved in other viral infections such as mumps, HIV, herpes, or cytomegalovirus. Acute febrile illness can hinder spermatogenesis, and 1 of 18 acutely infected and 6 of 34 recovering patients had scrotal discomfort, suggesting that the SARS-CoV-2 virus may cause orchitis. In hospitalized recovered men reporting moderate symptoms of the infection, there was a significant negative effect on the concentration of sperm, count, and progressive motility. These findings suggest that the viral infection may impact spermatogenesis, and the trend toward lower sperm concentration and count was shown in those with fever. However, the limitation of this study is that the sample was quite small, there was a short follow-up, lack of semen analysis prior to the viral infection, and only 1 semen analysis after infection. ACE2 expression is higher in the testes and epididymis than in the ovary, uterus, and vagina. SARS-CoV-2 infection may reduce male fertility by sexual transmission, and orchitis has been shown in 6 autopsies of men who died from SARS-CoV. Viral presence demonstrated in almost 60% of semen samples, as previously shown, and elevated LH in infected men may suggest gonadal dysfunction. SARS-CoV-2 might damage the testicles, spermatogonia, Leydig, and Sertoli cells. A female who died of Ebola infection after sexual contact with an infected survivor necessitates to explore the possibility of sexual transmission. The impact on female fertility can be assessed in autopsy of victims of this disease, evaluating the ovarian reserve, possible viral detection in the follicular fluid, and the IVF laboratory results. Furthermore, although previously reported that children are less likely to be infected, recently a severe form of Kawasaki-like disease has been reported. Amir Arab has published several recommendations for the IVF lab personnel. He has shown that a viral drop as small as 1 micron can vitrify in liquid nitrogen. Viral contamination of embryo cryopreserved in liquid nitrogen raises real threat, and he described 4 possible scenarios. One, where the vitrified drops can contaminate the sperm, oocyte, or the embryo in an open system vitrification, and the patient following warming. Second scenario, cross-contamination of samples with ACE2 receptors such as ovarian tissue and testicular samples. Third, contamination of the operator upon warming. And the fourth, best scenario, when there is no contamination due to low viral load or where the virus does not survive. A monoclonal antibody identified from memory B cells of an infected individual with SARS-CoV in 2003 could neutralize SARS-CoV-2 infection, according to a recent Nature publication. This antibody, engaged with the S receptor binding domain, recognized a glycan-containing epitope without competing with receptor attachment. This antibody could be used either prophylactically in high-risk individuals or as a post-exposure therapy to ameliorate severity. Similarly, almost 100 potential vaccines are being investigated, and just a few are under clinical trials for efficacy and safety. Does COVID-19 cause stillbirths? A recent JAMA publication has shown an increase in stillbirths during the pandemic in London, but none in documented COVID-19. Almost 1,700 births in 4 months before February, which means pre-pandemic period, were compared with a similar number of 1,700 deliveries from between February and June, which is due during the pandemic period. The preterm birth rate did not differ between the two groups. However, there was a significant increase in the stillbirth rate from 1.2% pre-pandemic to 7% during the pandemic period. All women experiencing stillbirth were asymptomatic, however, most of them not tested. PM and placental pathology examinations indicated that none of the stillbirths occurred in women with COVID-19, speculating that the reasons remain unclear. But it may include fewer prenatal visits because of hesitance of the patients to visit healthcare facilities. The 3 main reproductive authorities, ASRM, ESHRE, and IFFS, published together a commitment to continuous monitoring of the effect of the COVID-19 epidemic on the gametes, reproductive tissue, and to collect data on pregnant patients. We conclude that the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic is an ever-present threat leading to living with uncertainty. Thank you very much for your attention.
Zev, thank you very much for extremely interesting review of what we know about COVID and reproduction. I have a few questions for you, but maybe I read them all and you will summarize your answer because they are all related to the same topic. So the first one, based on your review, is it justified recommending preventing from being pregnant at this time? The other one, should women be under lockdown for 14 days before trying to conceive? Should everyone who wishes to conceive needs to have COVID-19 test, a negative test before getting pregnant? So maybe we'll summarize in few sentences what you think about the review that you've just presented.
Yes, thank you. The data in the published literature are controversial, whereas several publications show that the risk of transferring the virus through IVF and transplantal transaction is very low. Others cannot show that these risks are not existing, and therefore we have to be very, very careful. So yes, in my opinion, to be on the safe side, it would be probably safer to isolate infected patients for maybe 10 or 12 or 14 days. Probably 10 would be enough. It was very perplexing, the publication that a patient who tested negative for PCR, RT-PCR, did infect the neonate, and the presence of antibodies in her blood has shown that although she was RT-PCR negative, the presence of the antibody was evidence that she has been infected in the past and recovered from the acute infection. So nevertheless, she did infect the neonate, although she was at present RT-PCR negative. So there are many unanswered questions in this disease, making us very worrying about the possibility of transferring the disease to partners, to personnel, and to the offspring.
Okay, thank you very much. So I would like to thank you again for being with us today and giving such a profound review of the literature, which will actually close this session. So again, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends, this is Milton Leong from Hong Kong, and I am introducing tonight's webinar presented by IVF Worldwide. And our guest speaker tonight is none other than the very illustrious Professor Gary Shetton. Professor Gerald Shetton is a professor of obstetrics, gynecology, and reproductive science, cell biology, bioengineering, and division director of the Division of Development and Regenerative Medicine. Boy, talk about a long title. He's currently president of UNESCO's International Cell Research Organization. He has published more than 300 papers on stem cells, regeneration, fertilization, cell biology development, infertility, assisted reproductive technologies in premier journals, including Nature and Science. Tonight, Jerry is going to present a very interesting topic. I have to dig up to find out what this means. Why doesn't the ovary benefit from the longevity dividend? Jerry, please.
Milton, thank you very much, Milton, for that kind introduction. And with all of my titles and $5, I can get a cup of coffee at Starbucks. I'm so grateful to you and to Zev for your prescience in recognizing long before COVID that the world needed something beyond face-to-face meetings. Your genius in establishing the IVF World Online Congress, as well as the virtual university, has really laid the framework for where we are going to go in the future. I hope someday again we will come back to face-to-face meetings, but at least for the foreseeable future, if we had not had what you are doing, we would not have anything. So again, congratulations. Now, I would like to speak about the topic of why doesn't the ovary benefit from the longevity dividend? And I want to first explain the longevity dividend, but before I go into the longevity dividend, I must say a few words about where we are right now. All of us are feeling concerned that there is a tsunami that is gripping our planet in a way that is unprecedented in human history. This is almost like something that one would have learned about in the Bible, and it is terrifying. The entire planet is on lockdown, and this has never happened before. It represents a major challenge for all of us, especially those of us who are still in fragile stages of our careers. And I would like to address a few opportunities that may exist because of this unprecedented time. You'll find that there are interesting papers coming out. For example, people are more kind under COVID. So the COVID lockdown is leading to a much more respectful research culture. Many colleagues, many journals, many funding agencies, which previously were absolutely inflexible, are now showing greater flexibility because of the crisis. And perhaps even after the crisis is over or has been mitigated, we will be able to continue with this kinder, friendlier world. We're also finding that many people from disability communities, people who were blind, who are movement impaired, deaf, were unable to really participate face to face. And so they developed the wherewithal for much of the technology that we are using today. And I hope that the improvements in the technology will not only benefit those who don't belong to a disabled community, but certainly extend in a fully equitable way. We are together today regardless of time zone, regardless of visa status, regardless of countries that will or will not let us in a much more open fashion. In response to this, I know I will hear from dear friends and perhaps former trainees or future trainees from countries like Iran, where my country has challenges, and maybe the world will become a more harmonious place because we're all in this together. Now, I don't want to say that this is good news by any measure. As this article, which recently came out, notes, the invisible universities are COVID positive. And what they mean by the invisible university is there are many of us that are working as medical trainees, as postdoctoral fellows, as residents, and we're kind of employed, but not really. We're kind of, the institution has kind of a commitment to us, but not really. And you are the most vulnerable. And I hope we can use forums like this in the future to talk about strategies. And one strategy that nature is posing seriously is that the pandemic is prompting some early career researchers to rethink their hopes for a university post. If it is obvious that you do not have a future in what you are doing, let us, and there are communities for this, look in the mirror together and seek an exit plan where you may have a more rewarding and certainly more lucrative career rather than just staying in a rut. And this especially comes in relation to the ivory tower. This is the ivory tower of my school, the University of California, Berkeley. And I was happy to see that the ivory tower actually comes from the Old Testament. And so for Professor Chauhan, you will be very well aware, I'm sure, of the biblical reference. Now, the longevity dividend that I'm talking about is really quite remarkable. We know that there's aging occurring in our population, and aging has been slowed down in every single organ except the ovary. And what's happening now is, rather than having a Gaussian distribution of our populations, we are swiftly moving towards having a column-like population, where the people at the end of life are living longer and longer, and ironically, reproduction is not increasing to compensate that. So we're having a major demographic shift, and this is globally, from one in which there was a Gaussian distribution with many more young people at the younger ages and very few at the top, to one in which the population everywhere is elderly. And this has led some countries, for example, China, to relax the one-child policy because the elderly people are predicted to need young people to help them. And there are not enough young people to help the frail older people, and hence we need greater reproductive prowess, and consequently we see things, including here in our IVF online program. This is truly remarkable. Since 1840, there has been an increase in life expectancy of 3 months for every year. The life expectancy has just been going through the roof. And this is wonderful in some ways, but it also creates demographic and social problems in others. Now, certainly the increases at first had to do with hygiene and the sanitation of water. It also had to do with antibiotics and killing off various diseases with vaccines. And now we are at an extraordinary point where some have said perhaps we will level out, and others are saying, no, we may not level out. And another way of looking at this is that the majority of the population, not the majority, many populations are seeing a vast increase in the number of elderly, and that creates a demographic problem. Now, what's ironic is every organ in our body, our lungs, our heart, our brains, our muscles, our bones, immune system, has benefited from this longevity dividend, with the exception of one organ. And that organ is why we are here today. And that organ is the ovary. And I'll come back to that in a second. Now, you can see the changes in death rate were caused because various diseases were tackled, then various disabilities were tackled. I don't know in the future whether we will see a blip caused by COVID-19. COVID-19 is disproportionately going after the elderly, but I'm not sure yet whether it is at the global population level where it will even make it onto this sort of a graph. What's happening is that each different disease that crops up to kill us at the end of life, whether it's arthritis, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, COPD, is being tackled individually and with the hope of increasing longevity. This is like a game called whack-a-mole, where you whack a mole at the arcade. And for my Israeli friends, this is not whack-a-mole, this is whack-a-mole. And I'll explain that later. So we are trying to treat cancer, we are trying to treat heart disease. If we could cure cancer and heart disease, you could add about 5 years to life expectancy. And it's important to note, we want the vitality of long life. We don't want disability and frailty. And there's a whole new field emerging called geroscience, where you will slow aging. And if it were possible to slow aging, you might be able to add more than 25 years of healthy living. Still at the end, we will become frail, but you could add decades to our life. And this is sort of shown here where scientists are trying to slow down the rate at which the clock ticks. And there are promising areas in this field. For example, we're beginning to move from geriatrics, where you're managing people who have diseases, to geroscience, where you're extending the health span, not just the lifespan. You want to extend the span of healthy life. And there are a number of very promising small molecules that look like they can help extend the healthy lifespan. And so let me note that geroscience is different from geriatrics, in which you're trying to understand the biology of aging. And of course, aging in some ways represents a disease, but it also represents fundamental biology going from gametogenesis ultimately to death. There are treatments like dietary restriction, which in most every animal studied increases longevity. Now, in the people that have had dietary restrictions, they are constantly dreaming about an apple because they are so hungry. They're getting about 70% of the calories. So they look terribly unhealthy, but in terms of longevity, their lives are extended. There is some drugs, some compounds related to the sirtuins, and most interesting, there is a generic compound, a metformin, that's been around for a long time with diabetes that seems to also be able to forestall the ravages of aging. And there are many places that are looking at metformin now in clinical trials as a simple, well-understood method to extend lifespan. It's worthwhile considering what is the upper boundary of life in animals and what might be the upper boundary for us humans. When you order New England clam chowder, you get quahogs, and some of those quahogs are over a half millennium old. There are whale sharks off of Greenland that are 4 centuries old. There are some whales in which, when they've beached, harpoons have been found in them, and the harpoons were made before the Civil War. So they can certainly live over 2 centuries. We don't truly understand the upper boundaries of longevity, and it may well be that longevity in captivity is even greater than longevity in the wild. It's also interesting that there are some species in which the females have longevity but no longer are reproductively active. They go through a menopause. There are only a few systems in which this is understood. For example, in a couple of whales, of course, in women, we have menopause, and there's a little bit of evidence in elephants. But it's been clearly shown in whales that there are evolutionary advantages to having grandmothers. That is, your mother's mother who is no longer reproductively active, and she plays a critical role in the survival of the youngster and the harmony of the pod. Now, when we think about geroscience, we can think about various hallmarks of biological aging. For example, some of those will involve the telomere, genomic instability. Some of those will involve the mitochondria and nutrients. But this is basically a fundamental problem of cell biology in which we have so many of the tools to answer these questions. And so when I speak to the young people who might be in a research project that may not have a future, please think about areas which are needing brilliant minds to pioneer them, because the world is in a global crisis. And one of those areas is in biological aging. Something you do in the laboratory could translate globally. In the context of genomic instability, we know many things about how mitotic and meiotic spindles form, and yet we only poorly understand how the chromosomes segregate properly and what the checkpoints are and why they fail. Again, this is at the hallmark of cancer in addition to biological aging. At the ends of chromosomes, we know that as we get older, our telomeres, sort of like the tree leaves on the tree, get shorter and shorter. And at the ends of chromosomes, you have these arglets, which are these plastic pieces that keep the chromosome from fraying. Because once you get DNA damage in that frayed chromosome, you lose major parts of the chromosome. And There are molecular ways to extend the telomere, and you can see the telomeres beautifully here with a special stain. And indeed, there are companies out there that are offering to tell you what is your cellular age by looking at your telomeres. The notion is that if one of your telomeres is short, your lifespan may be much shorter. And in fact, some companies are arguing that you should first get your telomeres examined before you buy life insurance. Life insurance will be a very bad investment if you have long telomeres. On the other hand, you will be rich if you have short telomeres with that life insurance, but you'll be dead, so your ancestors will be left. But you can see the economic argument for this. There are questions about imprinting and epigenetic modifications, both in the DNA and in the histones, and certainly how the mitochondria process the buildup products is a major part of aging. It appears as if the diseases like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, various dementias are the result of poorly processing cellular wastes. And they all seem to come down to the fact that there are proteins in the cell which typically aggregate and then disaggregate. And as we get older, our brains are able to aggregate these proteins, but no longer disaggregate. And the proteins that aggregate in the brain that result in Alzheimer's disease are tau and amyloid. In Parkinson's, it's synuclein. There are different dementias caused by different disaggregation disorders. As the field of microRNAs are growing, so are the number of geriatric microRNAs. And this may also be a field worthy of examination. So fundamentally, every aspect of our cell biology and physiology can impact senescence. And indeed, if any one of them affects senescence, then you are going to become frail and die. Now, there are soluble factors within us that remarkably forestall aging and reverse the process of aging, sort of like Ponce de Leon's fountain of youth. If you take two mice and connect their blood systems, this is a technique called heterochronic parabiosis. A young mouse is fused with an old mouse, and there are factors from the young mouse that rejuvenate the old mouse. It rejuvenates the muscle mass, activity, it restores bone marrow, muscle, all sorts of different aspects. And Wall Street is all over this because they are keen to understand what is that factor there. And indeed, there was a company in San Francisco, it may still be around, which was getting plasma from Stanford undergraduates. And for $10,000 a week, they offered to give me the plasma from Stanford undergraduates, which would, they say, forestall my aging. As a PhD, I couldn't afford that, and I don't know if it worked anyhow. But again, there are methods either with diet or with senolytic drugs, drugs that block senescence, to reverse or forestall aging. And we know we have good evidence on this. Some of the compounds are noted here in this Nature paper, and there are many companies that are growing around these small molecules that work on different cell cycle checkpoints or other aspects that are predicted to affect the rate of aging in a global fashion. Congress is putting a fortune of money in that. The budget for the National Institutes of Aging has more than doubled in the last 3 years, and much of it was triggered because of Alzheimer's. And as I mentioned, many of these diseases are the result of aggregation of specific proteins, and different proteins lead to different diagnoses, but they all result in neurodegeneration and dementia. And literally, it's a problem of not being able to disaggregate these proteins. Now, I want to speak a little bit about economics, because if we could delay aging, all of our societies would benefit economically enormously. I hate to put us elderly people in the category of a societal burden, and I worry that some of our politicians may be grateful for COVID because it is specifically targeting the elderly, which is not proper at all. But our society could do so much better if we could delay aging and forestall the day when we need to go into nursing home. And so we have a trade-off between our elderly population and the research dollars that we put into this field. Here, for example, you can see the economic benefits if you were able to delay aging. It totally changes the budgets of so many of our countries, because right now we spend so much on health costs. And I want to point out that one strategy for life is to be a tungsten bulb. Tungsten filaments burn out like that, so that you live, you have a healthy lifespan, and then boom, you're gone. You do not want to be a fluorescent life bulb, because they flicker, and then only after decades do they fade away. And so we have to be mindful that we are trying to extend the health span, not just extend the lifespan. And there are concerns that some of the Alzheimer's vaccines that are beginning to move forward might have the result of extending longevity, but not affecting dementia, which might end up filling our nursing homes with more patients who are suffering from dementia. So let me come back to the fact that all the different aspects of the cell could be used for protecting us from aging. There are some specific compounds coming from mitochondria that may be vital for this. And you know that the ovary has this bizarre function that it produces superb eggs up until the 30s, and by the 40s and certainly the 50s, the production of high quality oocytes declines precipitously. And this is so unfair, because a 30-year-old woman, a 40-year-old woman, a 50-year-old woman nowadays is a young, vibrant individual. And the hardships of not being able to have children at a time in your life when they're so desired is really it's a catastrophe. And I think we in this community may be able to change the outcome of this catastrophe. You've all seen these data where the number of oocytes in utero go up to perhaps 7 million, and yet before birth, and certainly before the onset of puberty, we've brought that down to a very low number. Maybe naturally 400 oocytes might be ovulated, and maybe with assisted reproduction, that number might go to 1,000. But it's a trivial number of oocytes that are ovulated relative to the 7 million that are generated. And we don't understand why that's happening. Why can't we save some more of those oocytes? Now, oocytes are unusual cells in that they proliferate in fetal life, and then they arrest before birth. So an egg cell maybe has 24 cell divisions behind it. This is very different from a sperm, because there's a fundamental difference between male meiosis and female meiosis. In men, the sperm production continues from puberty on. So when you get sperm from this 15-year-old man, that sperm has about 35 cell divisions in terms of age. In contrast, sperm produced by a 50-year-old is getting close to 1,000 cell divisions. And there are some people in the neuropsychiatric community who are wondering, might there be errors each cell division in spermatogenesis, which results in the fact that children from men of advanced paternal age seem to have more neuropsychiatric diseases and be on the autism spectrum. So coming back to the question, why doesn't the ovary benefit from the longevity dividend? The answer in part appears to be that the ovary doesn't benefit because the oocyte is aging. And it's a remarkable field because it's just one cell in the entire ovary that's aging. And so how could we rescue that egg, or that immature egg? One notion is that there may be mitochondrial problems. This, by the way, is a cell from Henrietta Lacks. It's a HeLa cell. And when you look at the mitochondria, please remember there are many, many, many mitochondria in a cell. And mitochondria do many things that we don't begin to understand. They also move around in the cell. There are some forms of manic depressive disorder that have mitochondrial genetics behind them. And so please don't assume that the mitochondria is just a battery that we can swap out easily. I mentioned already how dietary restriction has keen effects in terms of expanding longevity, but not really with the ovary. And I think in your clinics, you're seeing that women who are very lean and very fit are still suffering age-related loss of their ovulation capabilities in the same way that women who are obese do. So the mitochondria is not just a battery. There's a lot more that we need to understand there. There have been techniques that were pioneered by Jacques Cohen, and now through the great work of John Zhang in New York and extended into the Ukraine, working on mitochondrial donations in which oocytes coming from healthy women with healthy mitochondria have the cytoplasm aspirated, and the cytoplasm is injected into the egg of a woman with a mitochondrial disorder. This was approved in the UK, though there have not yet been any results from the UK. It was initially designed for mitochondrial disease. Some of us are thinking that it might help with aging, but the evidence for that is still quite theoretical. And there are concerns that the children that are born might end up with mixed rates of mitochondria, neither the maternal nor paternal mitochondria, but a mix of perhaps donated maternal and paternal mitochondria. And we don't really understand what might happen in heteroplasmy with healthy mitochondria. It's a topic that's worthy of scientific investigation, perhaps before it's used in the clinic. There are complications doing stem cell exhaustion, DNA damage, and every other aspect of cell biology. And remarkably, there's an interesting breakthrough in the understanding of aging coming from Alan Spradling's lab at Johns Hopkins University, looking at Drosophila oocytes. Please remember that oocytes are metabolically quiescent. So they're not making RNA, they're not making protein. And in Dr. Spradling's lab, he's generating interesting data that is actually the RNA, the meiotic RNAs that are aging in oocytes. And perhaps if there was a way of stabilizing meiotic messenger RNA, there might be a way of keeping these oocytes fresher for longer. I think about methods for keeping things fresh so that when liquid nitrogen came along for freezing fish, that gave us much of the seafood that we enjoy today. And perhaps there'll be a method like liquid nitrogen and rapid freezing to maintain the oocytes for longer. So let me just end by saying there is a new field that's building up using a variety of these senolytics, and perhaps some of those won't be targeted to our somatic tissues, but actually to a woman's germline. And let me remind you that birthdays are good for you, because the more you have, the longer you'll live. I'll leave this up for a moment. There's a lot of words here, but please remember that this is an area in which smart people could make global differences in the health and well-being of our population. If we could figure out how to slow the aging of the oocyte within the ovary, we could bring so much joy and happiness to so many people around the world. And again, as we think about the COVID pandemic, we're going to get through this. I don't exactly know what I mean by that, but we're in it together and we're going to get out of it together. And so let me again thank Milton and Zev and the organizing committee for giving me this opportunity. Be safe, be well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jerry, for presenting a really, truly wonderful lecture. That is not only informative, but really thought-provoking. I think, we brought up something that we always have many kind of explanation. I always think that, if Darwin is right, and there's evolution, then somehow it neglected the woman's evolution as far as X is concerned. So if evolution, as we see, ladies with their opportunities, education, with their opportunities, in business and development their career, they probably would not start ovulating until 30 or 40. So that everyone would finish doing whatever first they might have in mind, and then they can have from 40 to 60 is equivalent, really, to our grandmother's days.
Absolutely.
Don't you agree, Jerry?
A girl born today is predicted to spend more than half of her life in menopause. It's remarkable, and it is just so bitterly unfair.
It's absolutely, I agree absolutely with you, and at the moment, there's nothing much we can do. I mean, we can store the eggs, but frankly, that's only for reproduction. It's not, really for their well-being and lifestyle. We can, can we really think of cutting off one ovary or, two ovary by the time they are, and let them have a short period of menopause, but then replacing them, to extend their hormonal life, not to mention just reproductive life yet, but at least
Right.
hormonal life.
So reversing menopause has many systemic benefits as well. And you can imagine a day when, say, a girl has an appendectomy. As long as you're in the neighborhood, why not take some of the ovary that you could freeze down, and when she, in her middle 40s or 50s, goes into menopause, you might be able to reverse that in the way that Sherman Silber and others have been doing around the world. I don't know that the day is here right now, but I would love to see that day.
That, I think, at the moment, we have touched on the technology. It can be developed. It needs to be developed further, both in preservation and also on how to start using them again. So there are a lot of things that we need to do, but at the moment, we are, of course, we have to, there's a lot of ethics, there's a lot of male dominance, that we haven't really looked, into this problem. And also, there's also a lot of ladies, who would say, geez, you men are trying to tamper with our life again. So, we got the science, but there's ethics and there's social choice, that whether they'll do it or not. But that's a little bit offline.
No, I agree with you, Milton, and thank you for those wise comments.
And but I think this lecture is really, it started a lot of things. At first, I thought you're only going to talk about, the longevity dividend, but it turned out, that I think you touch on such a wide field and such a really far-reaching. It stimulated, even within that 30 minutes, it's just like starburst. There's a lot of things, that I can think of, and it affected, my, I wouldn't call it intelligence. I don't even have that, but but it really stimulated, my thought process. Yeah, thank you very much, Jerry.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
Yes, thank you again. Thank you, Jerry. Ladies and gentlemen, fellow doctors, researchers, scientists, is this year with the pandemic, it changes a lot of things in our life and the way we practice. And we have to look at, in the future, what ART would mean to us, and also how it can be practiced. Certainly, screening for health, screening for virus, it could have been the same coronavirus, or it could have been anything new that will come along, will be part of our life from now on. And also, social distance, again, will be part of our life. Therefore, we have to think if it's absolutely necessary for us to be face to face and also contacting our patients as closely as before. Most of us will see our patients during either an egg collection cycle or an FET cycle, maybe at least 4 to 5 times. Some clinics do ultrasound and blood tests every day. So that means 14 to 15 or 16 times. Now, it will be difficult under our future practice that this can be done again. So we may have to think about what we should be doing. Is it going to be more standardized protocols, SOPs? Is it going to be more AI? But certainly, distant and video controlled contact will be the norm in the future. How are we going to do this? I think together with our profession, our specific IVF, and reproductive medicine, all the other medicines will be practicing distant diagnosis and distant treatment. Of course, there will be a lot of medical and legal concern, but when the whole world is aiming for this, I'm sure that we can work it out. For instance, we can even do ultrasound in distance, but at the moment, this is not possible yet, because we have to do ultrasound being such a operator-dependent procedure that we have to do it ourselves, and we can only trust ourselves or qualified technicians to do it. But on the other hand, perhaps a fixed, and we have 40 years experience, so definitely reliable SOP can be set up so we can see our patients less. So during this conference and others, and in the coming year, I'm sure we'll be looking at a lot of suggestions and maybe a lot of conclusions. And finally, like everything else in the last 35 years, we'll gradually come to some consensus of what is best practice.
I would like to share with you my vision of a future of IVF. It's really very difficult to guess the future. But I know that technology will be super important in the IVF lab. There's no doubt that IVF has been really a manual procedure up till now. So we have manually moved the cells, we have manually manipulated the cell, making the biopsy, the ICSI, everything rely on the operator. assessing the morphology rely today on the operator. So this means that there's a huge difference between one lab to the other. And this is not really what we want in healthcare. What we want in healthcare is that everywhere, in every single lab, we can ensure for our patient a minimum standard. And to reach this goal in every single country, everywhere in the world, we need to have more technology. More technology means more standardization, more reproducibility. Imagine a software that would assess embryo morphology. It will be maybe not the best of the best embryologists, but to have a minimum standard guarantee that can learn, because, with artificial intelligence and big data, software can really learn from the data that we provide to the software. So in the near future, we can really have effective software that can help us to standardize our procedure. And standardization is the key, because if we have a standard procedure, we can put together the data and improve with big data our prediction on IVF results. Because a second aspect that I see really necessary for the future is to have predictive model to explain and consult the patients. Today, when a couple go for a consultation, we cannot really predict which is their own chance of pregnancy, because there is so many confounding factors, ovarian reserve, number of oocytes, fertilization, blastocyst development, that we cannot really predict. And this for a patient is very frustrating. When a patient says, "Oh, your chance of pregnancy is between 20 and 40%, they cannot really understand really. It's a huge difference in this possibility of pregnancy. So really to involve the patient in the process, which means involving the patient means that the patient stay with us, and we know that they need to stay with us, not for a single treatment, but ideally for repeated treatment to better exploit the chance of pregnancy. We need to have predictive model to explain to the patient how much time, how much money they have to invest to reach the maximum chance in their particular case. There are many different companies that are working on this predictive model, and I see that this will really help patients in their journey, which is more and more difficult because patients are getting older and older. They are getting with lower and lower number of oocytes, with lower chance of pregnancy, means more cycle to be invested and more understanding and patience from patients to stay with us. So I see the dropout as a goal to avoid and to really increase the chance to have a live birth. We have really to make the patient together with us continuing the treatment.
My name is Roy Holmberg. I've been asked by Zev to envisage what I think IVF will be like in the future. Well, regarding ways of making babies, both IVF and even sexual intercourse may be made redundant. Reproduction may be done just in the laboratory, using egg and sperm from somatic sources, using stem cell-derived human gametes. Mitochondrial replacement will be used more and more to prevent some horrible lethal diseases, and may even be used to make older patients younger. CRISPR technology, endless possibilities, and hopefully will be used exclusively for the prevention of known genetic diseases. More mundanely, I hope there'll be easier and a more affordable accessibility to IVF for those who really need it, but also a reminder to use other proven effective methods of treatment before rushing couples straight from the street into IVF. Bye for now.
Zev Shoham, as chair of IVF Worldwide, asked me to share with you my views on what I would consider the most relevant developments in the next decade. And I give it some thought, and as far as I'm concerned, there are 4 issues which I would like to stress. Number 1, I think that there will be much focus on IVF, make it more simple and more robust, in line with that, reduce cost and increase access to care. That's the first and I think most important development. Development number 2 is many technical advances and automated systems in the embryology laboratory, and from the clinical side, the introduction of e-health and the use of artificial intelligence and big data. Number 2. Number 3, problems around ovarian reserve will rise even further. So we have to focus more carefully on how to diagnose this condition. And most importantly, is there any useful therapy which could be developed for this? And number 4, and last but not least, as we all know, IVF was originally developed as a treatment for infertile couples, but we will continue to witness more and more use of ART under conditions which has nothing to do with infertility per se. What I mean by this is the use of ART in single individuals who wish to have children, or same-sex couples, both male and female.
The future of IVF is extremely bright. Advances in technology will not only help improve success rates, but also will make IVF more accessible so that everyone around the world has the opportunity to have a family.
IVF started more than 40 years ago, and time is running very fast, and the future is approaching even faster. Many changes occurred during this last decade, from infertility treatment to conservative management of many gynecological diseases and fertility preservation. No doubt that more and more we will pay attention to conduct a more conservative and gentle approach in many gynecological diseases. And we should pay attention in the new algorithm to take care of the patient desire.
Dear colleagues, dear friends, I am happy you are here with us today. What I think is exciting in our specialty in 2020 is that we are able to propose to almost all our patients a solution, a treatment, hope, as the progress that was made these last decades in infertility preservation and IVF was huge. So let's continue that way.
Well, the future of IVF is difficult to tell in advance what was going to happen, but there is a general trend toward stabilizing the results so that all clinics really have the same thing. And what we're going to be talking today about, the KPIs and key performance indicators, is heading in that direction. And also, I think the future of IVF will consist in trying to transfer embryos that have good chances of implanting, either by PGTA, as we do now, or maybe one day we discover a way to do this non-invasively. But the bottom line is to transfer embryos that have chances to implant, and not those who are bound to fail anyway.
So I actually believe that in the future, with all the improvement in technology, genetics, and the issue of the big data, we'll all need to gather information on our patient characteristic, put it in the computer, and the computer will tell us which protocol we should choose, which mode of treatment, of trigger, the medication, and even also if the patient may benefit from all of these add-ons that we are offering the patient now, and we don't know if they're actually improving the outcome or not.
I believe there will be a huge progress in the three factors that govern embryo implantation. And these are embryo quality, endometrial receptivity, and the transfer efficiency. A lot of these will be automated based off artificial intelligence, so that the sustained embryo implantation rates would reach sky high.
My vision for the next 5 to 10 years in reproductive medicine is heavily leaning on the development of pre-implantation genetic diagnostics. I think this is a booming area where the technology of IVF and ICSI is now used to prevent many diseases that can keep people and healthcare workers busy for many centuries. So the prevention of diseases like Huntington, cystic fibrosis, Recklinghausen, well, there's a long list of potentials. I think this is really a big future for assisted reproduction. And my second line is that I think within 5 years, we probably do freeze all only and refrain from doing fresh transfers because of the problems that we have with all the luteal support issues. So I think the freeze all is part of this future developments.
If I have to summarize the future of ART in 2 sentences, I think number one would be the future of automation in the lab. I think a lot of manual things that are being done today by technicians and embryologists will be done by machines in a much more precise manner. And the second concept would be probably editing the germline. The possibility to relieve the burden of genetic conditions, and even the fact and the huge revolution of the stem cell development of gametes from somatic cells, I think will change completely the way we practice. And we'll see if in the future we're right or not.
Professor Seth Shoham has asked me to say a few words about what I think are the future directions of IVF in the next 10 to 30 years. I have 3 or 4 points to make. The first is that there's today a rapidly aging population, and with delayed childbearing, declining number of children, and an aging workforce, this leads to an increasing number of retirees being supported by a smaller workforce, which causes tremendous strain worldwide in their social systems. Universal egg freezing may help to elevate this idea. Universal egg freezing, in which every young woman in her early 20s would have a single ultrasound scan performed around day 8 to 10 of the cycle, so that when the biggest follicle is between 12 to 14 millimeters in diameter, a single channel 19 to 21 gauge quasi-lumen needle is used to both aspirate and flush if needed, could be used to aspirate a large number of mature and a huge number of immature eggs in a single cycle. We have in fact already collected more than 100 eggs in each cycle using this technique. These eggs could then be frozen using automated vitrification machines, which eliminates human variability. The availability of literally thousands of eggs for each person will allow genetics tests to be done to screen out aneuploid and other genetic abnormal embryos and eggs. The second idea is that of personalized treatment. As we know, different people with the same stage of the same cancer may respond quite differently to different chemotherapeutic regimens. And yet we continue to use the same stimulation regimens irrespective of ethnic background or race throughout the world. I think the availability of big data and artificial intelligence would allow us to produce more personalized protocols of treatment based on the person's age, race, ethnic background, ancestry, history of herself as well as family history of any genetic abnormalities, ovarian reserve, to derive the best protocols to get the best quality eggs, so that we can then get the best results per treatment cycle. Thirdly, the development of artificial uteruses and placentae may allow women who are at medical risk of pregnancy, for example with heart disease or other medical disorders, or whose pregnancy rate is very small because of deformities or abnormalities in the uterus, to be able to successfully carry pregnancies without risk to themselves. Finally, the widespread availability of sperm and egg freezing in young people may allow the notion of genetic immortality, a dream of our forefathers. However, this is fraught with controversy and would be the subject of widespread societal and bioethical debate, and not just that of physicians and scientists like ourselves in this field. Thank you.
IVF in 5 to 10 years will clearly be different. And I think the differences will change how we practice at two different levels. There's, first of all, the scientific level, where I'm pretty certain that over the next 5 to 10 years, we will learn two very important things that will dramatically change routine IVF practice. One is to culture in vitro primordial follicles to maturity. If we can achieve that, we can really do fertility preservation, because it will be possible to do a tiny biopsy of cortical tissue from the ovary and get hundreds of eggs that can be frozen away. You will not have to torture patients through multiple IVF cycles for much smaller egg numbers. But the ultimate step that will really change IVF, both routine IVF, but also in many social aspects, is our ability to create new eggs and new sperm from stem cells in the mouse. That was achieved already a number of years ago, so I'm convinced it is doable. It raises a million questions. It will still take time, but I know that a lot of laboratories are working on that. And imagine what that would achieve in terms of fertility if you, from peripheral cells or hair cells, could make eggs. It would change the science of IVF, but in addition, it would also radically change the practice of IVF, because you would no longer have to do retrievals. So the IVF structure would change. There would probably be central laboratories that do little skin biopsies or mucosal biopsies or whatever, and then start producing eggs for you or sperm for you. And those labs may also fertilize them and create embryos, and then ship those embryos to what now are IVF centers, but in those days will have a very different function than they have today. Which really brings me to the second, I think, futuristic prediction, and that is that how we treat our patients will change dramatically, because we learned now through the COVID crisis that we don't have to meet with the patients for consultation. We can do it long distance through electronic means. So at the present time, patients really come into our center only for monitoring and for the procedures, meaning retrieval and transfer. Imagine down the road if there's no retrieval needed anymore. Imagine further if they don't have to come for monitoring. I predict that probably within a relatively short time period, we will have tools where patients at home will be able to insert a vaginal ultrasound, and we will basically be able to measure follicle sizes through their phone from anywhere in the world. That will eliminate all visits to infertility centers except for the procedures. And so I think practice will change dramatically. And I haven't even talked about the entry of Wall Street into our field with outside investors buying up IVF centers and creating new ones in unprecedented numbers. Which also will have a very significant impact on how our field continues.
Hello, I was asked to give my vision on the future of IVF. That's always a risky thing to do. In the distant future, I feel very confident, whether it's 10 years from now, that we'll be doing in vitro gametogenesis. That is, making oocytes for women who no longer have young oocytes, and we'll be making very young oocytes using iPS cells derived from a simple skin biopsy. So even for a 38-year-old woman, it might be better to do a skin biopsy than an egg retrieval. So it's distant future, but the science is there. It's going to happen. It works certainly in animal models, and we are starting it now in humans on an experimental basis. But in addition to that, I think that the trend towards having babies later and later is going to increase, and fertility preservation will be high pressure, but women still won't do that. It will not grow like it ought to grow because psychologically, you just don't think at age 25 you have to worry about it. And you usually worry about it by the time you're 38 or 40. So it won't grow like it should. But I think egg donation will become a booming part of IVF for that reason until we perfect the in vitro gametogenesis. I'm also envisioning a greater use of IVM and minimal stimulation protocols. And I'm seeing a lower pregnancy rate with a patient's own eggs because women are getting older. And I also think PGS, though it's so popular, is certainly a flawed technology and will actually lower baby rates because of misdiagnosis of embryos as abnormal. It would have been normal babies. That last one is extraordinarily controversial, and that's why I saved it for last. But I can see the widespread popularity of PGTA resulting in lower success rates. So that's just my quick 2-minute vision.
So my view on the future of IVF is that we are now studying human folliculogenesis, development of follicles at an earlier stage than we have normally been doing. Because we do ovarian tissue freezing, we have now normal human follicles available. And I do think we are now slowly moving down the ladder, understanding how smaller follicles are being developed. Each one of these follicles contain an immature oocyte. These may be follicles which just have a few millimeters in diameter. I do think that we will see a huge development in our ability to in vitro mature these oocytes. And we will be able to just treat these oocytes in 25 microliters of culture medium. So it will not be necessary to the same extent to stimulate women to undergo ovarian stimulation and have mature follicles. We will slowly start to understand how we do this with human, as we can do with most other domestic animal species. I do think that in 10 years' time, we may approach an exogenous free gonadotrophin infertility treatment,
which would be absolutely fantastic in my view.
My vision for the future of IVF treatment is that ovarian stimulation will be more personalized thanks to our ability to analyze and extract insights for large data sets. I think that the industry will successfully produce molecules to be taken orally to stimulate the FSH receptor and replace gonadotrophin drugs. Sperm selection will be automated, including choosing the best sperm for fertilization and possibly gender selection too. Lab will become nearly fully automated, which will equalize this quality performance measure across centers. With the future possibility of producing gametes from somatic stem cell, fertility preservation will no longer be necessary. Lastly, uterine preparation for embryo transfer will be done more expertly and accurately by measuring objective parameters. Finally, I would like to thank all those who are willing to share their thoughts and insight with us. It would be interesting to hear from key people in the industry what they envision for future of IVF procedure. But this we will leave to the next Congress. Thank you very much for all of you, and thank you very much for listening.